I want to talk about sending emails in your Rails application and how we can do that using SMTP and Mandrill's API. So Mandrill is a service that allows you to send emails very easily, and you basically just register and connect it to your Rails application. And that's as simple as it needs to be. You'll do that over SMTP, but there's also an API that allows you to create templates inside of Mandrill, and you can use those to design your application in a way that allows your customers, if you're consulting or your marketing people or whoever, to go and change the emails at any point in time. You will just give them some variables and content that they could put in the email if they choose to. And that allows you a lot of flexibility, and you don't have to update your Rails application every time you want to change an email. So let's dive into this. I think the first thing we want to do is open up our application and go into the development environment file. So we'll go into config, environments, development.rb. And the line that we want to add here at the bottom is the exact same as the one that Devise told us to do before. I haven't actually done it, so I'm going to add it now. And that is a config.actionMailerLine.default URL options. And we're going to set this equal to a hash with the host key's value is going to be set to localhost :3000, because that is the URL domain that I type in my browser when I'm doing development. So when you want to send an email with your Rails application, you pass in to Action Mailer the objects that you want to use, and Action Mailer handles this by defining who is going to receive the email, who's sending the email, what the subject is, and what the view of the email should look like. So the view of the email is either an HTML or a text template that you render, and that gets sent back to the SMTP server, and it's handled appropriately. The reason why we have to set this URL host option here is because there is no URL that this came in on for sending an email. Because sending an email is a separate transaction, you want to define what's going on here separately so that you can use this in other areas. So, for example, if you have a background script that runs every night at midnight and that needs to send an email out for some reason, well, there's no request that has come in to your website that you can count on. So what you end up doing is you configure the mailer to globally have this feature, and then as that is necessary, when an email is being sent, it will use that. You're not really inside your Rails application to the same extent as you are when you're in a controller. The Action Mailer stuff is significantly separate, and it's important to understand the separation of Action Mailer and the rest of your Rails application, because I've seen a lot of confusion come out of that. Your Action Mailer is really just a tool to integrate with a remote mail system that you can use in your application to send information out to users. Of course, anytime that you modify your config environments, initializers, or your gem file, you want to make sure you restart your Rails server. So we might expect that if we went into our application now and clicked login and clicked forgot your password, and you typed in your email address here, when you click send the instructions, you get a notice saying that it sent the email, and you would maybe expect that you would receive an email. Well, the reason it doesn't actually send one is because you haven't configured your Action Mailer to actually connect to an SMTP server to send the email across. And if you look at your Rails logs, you can see that when it actually sent the email, it rendered it out in the terminal. And this tells you that the email was actually trying to be sent, which is good. However, it didn't correctly send, and it sort of failed silently. And that's something that you just need to be aware of, that Sometimes your emails will send, sometimes they won't, and you need to be very clear that this is working and this isn't working or whatever. So you don't want ambiguity there when something is failing. The way that you can change that is to go back into the development.rb, and you can tell it to raise delivery errors when a mailer can't send, and you can set that to true. In development, we don't really want it to fail when we're doing our first version of testing the emails. So if we've never had it work before, then it's good to see what things are going wrong. At a point when you actually have your application fully built and functional, and you trust that sending the emails works, then you can go back and set this to false, because in development, you probably don't need to send yourself a whole bunch of test emails after you've tested to make sure that it's working. So if you want to do this, it's optional, but you'll need to also restart your Rails server if you change this. One other configuration option I want to change real quick is if you go into config, initializers, devise, there is a mail sender option here that is basically the email address where your devise mails come from. And when it says please change me, it's probably a good idea to change it. So we're going to just change this to my Go Rails address. And if you are familiar with email formatting for email addresses, you can actually put a name in here, or let's do Chris at GoRails. And then you can wrap your email address in greater than and less than symbols, so then your name will show up as well as the email correctly getting parsed. After you register with Mandrill, you'll get taken to the homepage, which gives you links to set up SMTP or the API version of Mandrill. And we're going to take a look at the SMTP version. And if we jump in there, we get presented with this. And it basically is saying, here's where you will send the emails to. You'll connect to it over port 587. Your username will be your email address, and your password will be any of the API keys that you create. So we're going to create an API key, and you just click the button and it creates an API key for you. So we can take this information now and set it up inside of our Rails application. Before we go back to our Rails application, let's copy the API key to the clipboard so we can paste it into our configuration as we write it. So if we go back to MacVim, we can create a new file in the config initializers folder called mail.rb. If you want, you can separate the configuration out separately for development and production and use two different mail servers if you'd like. I'm going to configure my application to use the same Mandrill account for both, because I'm generally not going to be sending many in development, and I really want to make sure that configuration works the same between the two. So in here we can set up action mailer base.smtp settings. And this is going to be a hash of options that will define the connection to the server, similar to the database.yaml. You set up the host and the port and everything in your database.yaml to the SQL server, and you'll do the same thing here to connect to your SMTP server. And that means that our address is going to be smtp.mandrillapp.com. Port will be 587. We want to enable start TLS auto as true, and then our username is the email address that we created our account with, and the password, like we just saw, is the API key that we created. And then lastly, we want to set the authentication to login. Now these are all specific to SMTP connections, so don't worry about them too much unless you're using a different service like SendGrid and it needs different configuration options. And then the last two things that we want to do is set up action mailer base to, by default, use SMTP as the mail server that we'll use. And the very last one is action mailer base dot default, and we're going to set the character set to UTF-8. So this will allow us to send any of the UTF-8 characters across, and it won't choke on them. Now we can restart our Rails server to initialize all of the SMTP configuration, and we can go back to our Rails app and click Forgot Your Password, and I'm going to send a Forgot Your Password email to chris@gorails.com. I've already created this account as well as exit3@gmail.com, which is my other email address. So if I send this password reset instructions, we'll get the same message as before, and immediately you can see that I got an email, and it has come from Chris@GoRails and the Chris@GoRails email address. So the name that we displayed before is also displayed here properly. And we can click Change My Password to come back to our application and follow the new password flow of things. So it has a reset token that it sets and allows you to go set your new password, which you can do, and click Change My Password, and you're back into your application, logged in as that account. So if you'd like to customize the content of the email that Devise sends for Reset Your Password, you can go into the App, Views, Devise, Mailer folder and see the password instructions. And this is where it generates the email content. But in order to get to this file, you need to make sure that you run Rails generate devise:\views, and that will generate these files and make them available for you to customize. Now imagine you want to add your own email that gets sent out when a new user is created. You like to see the users that are signing up, kind of get notifications of that, and then be able to write a personal note to each person. So you want to set up an after create email that happens when a new user signs up. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to generate a mailer we'll call it admin mailer, because this is an email that only goes out to admins in the site. So that will be you and pretty much nobody else for the moment. So we'll generate this mailer, and then we can open it up in our text editor. So we can go into the admin mailer, and because this inherits from action mailer base, this is the exact same class that we configured in our mail.rb. And you can see that here in all of these lines, and that means that we automatically have these settings applied to this mailer. So this mailer will be connected to Mandrill over SMTP. So we can change the from email address to something like noreply@gorails.com, because this is just a notification, and if we reply to the email, we don't need to do anything with it. So we'll leave it at that, and then that way, like when you reply to the email, it just gets ignored. And because we are making a mailer to only ourselves, we can have this go to chris@gorails.com. Now this will be overridable in the individual methods, but we're not really going to worry about that. We can make a new email by just defining a method, and I'm going to call this one new user, and we'll pass in the user that we want to send the email about. And because we have the to and from already set up, when we call the mail method, all we need to do is send in a subject, and we can say new user, and we'll pass in the user.email in the subject of that. So this mail is similar to a respond to in a controller, where this will say, okay, set up in mail, and we'll send it out, and then this will automatically look in our app views admin mailer folder for the same template name, new user HTML ERB. So we can go create that, and we can create app views admin mailer new user.html.erb. And I'm going to split the window so that we have app mailers, admin mailer here right with us. And we actually need to, similar to our views, we have to set at user as a variable, an instance variable, so that when the view is rendered, the variable is available. So we'll just do a simple h1 and we'll print out at user.email here. And that's all that we'll do. And the email will be very simple, but it will be sent out when the user is created. So if we go into our user model, we can go add an after create at the bottom here. So we can say after create send notification. And this method send notification will just simply call the admin mailer dot new user. And because this is an instance method, we'll pass in self, which is the current user, and we will call .deliver on it. And this will create the email, and then the deliver will actually send it. So the first part is just initializing it, and the deliver will actually send it out. Now, in order to test this, I'm going to open up the Rails console and just delete the last user that I created, which happens to be my chris@gorails.com account, and you can see that here. And now we can jump back into our Rails application, and because I've deleted the account I was logged in as, I'm signed out, and this time if I sign up and I put in a password, I will be signed in. It'll appear that nothing has changed to the user, but my email already has a new email, and you can see exactly the email address of the person who signed up. So that is a very quick way of integrating Mandrill with SMTP and setting that up, and you have a fully transactional email system built without any trouble at all. But to change the emails, we actually have to go in here, we have to edit this, we have to pass in new variables, and we have to do a bunch of work just to make any changes in the emails. That might be okay, but for a lot of customers that you're building a site for, you're going to want to allow them to be able to change how the email works without having to hire you to put in some more time to make a change. And that's what we're going to talk about next with Mandrill API integration. So Mandrill provides a RESTful API that you can integrate with your application. So you can send a request over to Mandrill through an HTTP post, for example, and that will be interpreted by Mandrill to take the data you give it and send out an email. So you don't actually have to connect to Mandrill through SMTP. You can talk to it just like you would talk to another web server. So you can make a post request just like your users are making post requests on your site. Your website will do the same to Mandrill, and Mandrill will send out an email. So we're going to talk a little bit about this, and the way that you want to integrate this with Rails is through the Mandrill API Ruby gem, and it's hosted on Bitbucket. Most of these seem to be hosted on GitHub, but this one just happens to be on Bitbucket. There's not a ton of good documentation on it, but it's not very hard to use, so we'll be able to jump into that pretty quickly. Now you want to grab the line for your gem file and install that as normal, and we'll paste it here and run bundle and restart our Rails server. So the admin mailer that we have configured right now uses Action Mailer's SMTP integration with it, and that works really well. We can also use the same class to define methods to send emails over the API instead of using the SMTP mail method that we are right now. So we could create a new method called new book, and we'll pass in the book, and inside here we can call Mandrill's API instead of the mail method, and that would do the same thing as sending an email across. So we actually want to do a few things before we get in too deep with the Mandrill API. And the first thing that we want to do is define a method in here called the Mandrill client. And this will be how we connect and talk to Mandrill over the API. So we're going to add the Mandrill client variable here, and this is, if you're not familiar with the nil guard, basically when you call this method, it will execute the code here on the right side and save it in the variable, and then the next time you call it, it will just return the results from the variable rather than executing the code again. So you can kind of cache things really quickly in memory. And we are wanting to cache the Mandrill API client. And the client will have the API key that we have before stored here. So we're actually going to name a constant called the Mandrill API key, and we'll pass that in. So if we go into our mail initializer that we created before, this is our API key that we created. Now we want to put it in two places. So it makes sense for us to delete this and use a constant in both places. So we can have it in our initializer and in our mailer. And we can take this and assign it at the top of the file. Oops. Since we set a constant like that, we're also going to want to restart our Rails application to have that set globally across our app. Inside of Mandrill, we can go into the outbound menu and go down to templates. And here's where you can create these templates that we'll use to render emails for us. So similar to the view templates that we have inside our application, like the new user.html ERB, we can create a template on Mandrill that will store it remotely and then keep track of that and make it customizable. So the name of our template we can call new book, and we'll add this template, and you can put in the HTML and the text over here, as well as configure a little bit about the defaults for the from address and who it's from and the subject. We can also override those from our application and handle how that works. So imagine that we want to do the same notification but with a book instead. If you're not familiar with MailChimp at all, they have these things called merge tags. And they're essentially variables that you can put inside of your application that, inside of your template, that are replaced dynamically. So we can name this the book name, and this variable denoted by the asterisk and the pipe will automatically get replaced by a variable that we pass across. We also want to define the from address and the name before we move on, because we don't need to specify this every single time in the mailer when we send out these emails. So if we publish this template, we will have it available in our application to talk to. And if we go back into our mailer, down in the new book method, we can begin defining access to that and how we're going to replace the book name variable in our template with the content that we have. So we have the book, and if you're forgetting, the book.rb model has the name column on it. It's not title, it's called name. So this is another case where annotate is really helpful because you can easily look that up. Was it name? Was it title? And you know in about 2 seconds. So in here, we want to define several variables that we're going to pass along to Mandrill that will determine who this gets sent to and everything. Now, these defaults that we defined up here are going to be ignored because this is not talking over SMTP. So everything in Action Mailer is going to get ignored essentially because it's going to be handled by Mandrill itself. So the first thing we want to do is we want to declare what template we are looking for. And the one that we created is called new book. And if you go over to Mandrill, you can see the template slug is called new book. And they even have a little helpful hint here that you use the template slug to identify this template in the API or via SMTP headers. So that is what the new book string comes from. And we can also define a thing called template content. Now, I'm going to leave this empty because the template content that Mandrill provides is okay, but I'd prefer to use the merge tags instead. And we're going to use those and create that right now. So if we create the message, this is what defines the email itself. So we can say that this email goes to, and we can provide an array of people that it goes to, and you can put in the email, and I'm going to hard code it as my email. If you want to make it dynamic, then you would pass in a user in here, and then instead of this, you would say user.email. But because I want it hard-coded, I'm going to do that because this is an admin notification. And the name option you can also add in. So you can put your name in there if you want. You can leave it blank. It's not required. And that makes it just a little friendlier when you receive the message. The next option, of course, is the subject of the email. And just like before, we can say new book. And we can add the book.name in there as well. So this next option is called merge vars, and this is the array of options that you can pass in that are variables that will be replaced by the string. So we have book name, and we'll define that here to get replaced in the template. Now this is a little bit different because when you're sending an email like this with SMTP, you do it one by one. So you go talk to the server and you say, hey, send this out, hey, send this out, hey, send this out. And with the API, we can actually define a whole bunch of these at once. So imagine that I want to send an email to bob@gorails.com or admin@gorails.com. I could do that by just adding items into this to field and they would get sent. And the merge vars are interesting because when you create these, you have to provide a recipient, and that will check the list of emails that you're sending to and see if it matches, and then it will apply it to that email. So every email that you send out could have the same template, but different content. So it's really interesting that you can do that all in one request. And for this, we'll want to have the same matching email address as before, and we can pass in the vars option, which will be a bunch of variables that we would like to replace. And of course, the first one is going to be book name, and the content for that is going to be thebook.name. So we can save that and then close our recipient. And then we have a closing tag for the merge vars, and we've defined all of the things that we need inside of our message variable. So the next step to actually send this over to Mandrill is to call the Mandrill client method, which we defined up here. We defined it there, and we call it here. We talk to the messages route, and we want to send a template with the template name of new book, template content that we defined, which is nothing, and the message itself. And if we save this, we can actually test this out with a book. And let's do that in our terminal rather than integrating it with the model just yet. So we can grab a book, and we'll just grab the first book, which is How to Win Friends and Influence People. And we can say the admin mailer dot new book and pass in that book. And we don't have to call deliver on this because deliver will initiate the SMTP call. But because we're doing that with the last line here, we're telling it to execute. We don't need to call .deliver on the end. So we can just simply run this, and we see that we ran into a problem called uninitialized constant Mandrill API. Now, this is because the gem file that we have needs to call an option called require Mandrill. Now they named the gem Mandrill API, but the module inside of it is actually called Mandrill. And we can see that when we call this Mandrill API. So by default, the gem will require Mandrill API, but since the name doesn't match, you have to add this special option in there. It's one of those things that is not obvious, and because their documentation is a little lacking, I'll say, it's kind of frustrating to work with a gem like this when it's not very smooth in some places. But generally, it works really well, and we can restart our Rails console and run the same command. And we can say book equals book.first. And then we do admin mailer new book, pass in the book, and this time it will find the Mandrill API constant and send it over. So we get a null mail response back because we didn't actually send a real action mailer request. However, when we check our email, we should get a new email from Mandrill. And if we take a look at this email, it's got the right name for the person to send it from, it has the right title, and if we look inside of the email, it's got the right title. So this is all working correctly, and now we can go into Mandrill and just simply make changes. So if we want to, we want to say new book : in here as well, we can publish that. And then if we go back to our terminal, we can run the new book method again, send another email, and we immediately get a new email with the change. So we're able to make changes to the email instantly. And the only thing this depends upon is that you provide the variables across. So if you want to add a new variable, you'll have to do that. But to change the look or the layout or any of those things in the email, you can do that without having to touch your Rails application.